thank for our Leadership Alliance Club in Madrid, led by President Latvia Vaida. She is very enthusiastic and very great contribution support for us, collaborate to organize this conference. This time she cannot come, but in this May I can meet with her, and she do very much for us, and also we honor her as one leader, excellent innovation leader, distinguished innovation leader. And thank you so much for President Vaida, and thank you so much for partnership with our Leadership Alliance. And today at the conference, we are honored to introduce Governor Michael Dukakis, give opening remark. Thank you so much.
Well, that's a good entrance. Sorry about that. Got a class and she had a meeting on the North-South Rail Link, and here I am. So, anyway, Tuan, thank you, and thank you all. Needless to say, Tuan's the guy that actually brought us here, helped to create this, and we've been at it now for, what, 4 or 5 years, and doing our best to bring public attention to bear on some very important international issues. And we thank you all for being a part of this and working with us. I hope we're making a difference in a somewhat turbulent world these days, but I can't remember when it wasn't turbulent, so this is kind of par for the course. But we hope we can use our collective influence to damp down the turbulence and magnify the constructive solutions to some of these problems. And we thank you all for being here. And again, special thanks to Tuan for bringing us all together in the first place. I always have an interesting discussion with Tuan about the number of speakers. And I keep telling him we got to try to keep the number of speakers small and the number of discussants and the amount of time for discussion large. So we've kind of struck a compromise here. And we're going to ask Matthias Schütz first, since I think he has to be on a plane, to kick this off, and then Nasli and Mark Rodenberg and Joe Nye, which is a pretty good quartet. And then we're going to open things up to you guys, because that's the fun part of this. I'm a learner here when it comes to our AI. You know, I was a kid from Brookline who decided to go to a Quaker school outside of Philadelphia called Swarthmore back in 1951. I had never been out of New England. I didn't know a Quaker from a Shaker. And I found myself 9 miles southwest of Philadelphia with some of my classmates trying to figure out why the barbershops in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania would cut the hair of black kids at Swarthmore. This is back when America was great. And we decided to boycott the local barbershops, and I became a campus barber. I made my walking around money at Swarthmore for 4 years, cutting hair on the 3rd floor of Wharton Hall. Without a barber's license. Don't tell the barber board in Pennsylvania that, because I value my reputation for integrity, and this is one case where I kind of swerved a little bit to serve a greater cause. And I graduated in 1955, and 6 weeks later was being sworn in at the Fargo building in the United States Army. And with a motley group of 30 others from the Boston area, got on a train, went down to Fort Dix to do our first 8 weeks of basic training. And 3 days after we got there, we had what passed for a personnel interview. Another draftee who was a personnel specialist, so-called, who would spend about 5 minutes with us and then decide what we would do for the next 2 years. But at that time, some draftees who had been involved in active politics were being singled out if they were members of organizations viewed to be subversive, pinko. It was a whole vocabulary. And I had one friend who preceded me at Swarthmore and was also from Brookline, who was held for months at Fort Dix because he'd been a member of something called the United World Federalists, which was basically a strong kind of world government advocacy group. It wasn't left, it wasn't right. And I don't think I had decided at that point definitely that I wanted to go into politics, but it was in the back of my head. And discovered when I sat down for my interview that the guy who was interviewing me had a file on me. This is in pre-computer America. Manila file with every single political activity I'd ever engaged in at Swarthmore College. So the interview went something like this. So I see you ran a fundraising drive for the American Civil Liberties Union when you were at Swarthmore. I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I did. And you were the chairman of Students for Democratic Action, which was the student wing of the ADA. I said, yeah. By the way, I was succeeded in that capacity at Swarthmore by a guy named Carl Levin, who served 18 years in the United States Senate, was the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And that's the way the interview went. Fortunately for me, he didn't recommend me for another non-discharge and decided to send me to Korea, which is okay. And it took us 10 years to find out where they got that information. Where do you think they got that information? Any idea? The FBI had a tap on the Swarthmore switchboard and was recording every single phone call that went through the place and then paying somebody to make notes on guys like me. Well, that was then. Here we are. On to our subject at hand. And let me begin by inviting Matthias to join us. And I'm going to sit and do some learning because one of the things that happened to me at Swarthmore is I decided to take physics and I got a charitable deed, decided to go into politics instead. So somewhat limited on the technical side of things, and always interested in learning and saying very little at events like this. Matthias, come on.
Thank you, Governor. So thank you again, Governor Dukakis. Thank you, Tron, for having me. Let me apologize right away. Unfortunately, originally this was scheduled for the morning, and when it moved to the afternoon, it conflicted with my flight. So after my presentation, I have to storm out, but I hope to be able to watch the videos of the other presentations and that way be able to maybe engage after the event today with you. What I'd like to talk about is ways in which we think we can ensure that AI and robotics technology will be used for the good of humanity. And I want to start with the punchline argument. AI and robotics technology will ultimately, I believe, require built-in ethical constraints to ensure that the technology is safe and beneficial to humans. The greatest danger I see with AI and robotics technology is from unconstrained machine learning, algorithms that have no constraints based on what they can and what they will learn, where the system can acquire knowledge and start to pursue goals that were not intended by the human designers. So to safeguard these technologies, it's not sufficient to specify what to optimize or to add an emergency off button that you can push, because the system might change the goals, its own goals, and it may actively prevent its shutdown. Rather, what I think we need to do is we need to design these systems from the ground up to include, even at the hardware level, some of these ethical provisions that include representations of social and moral norms, ethical principles, and laws and other principles that the system cannot ignore and must use in its operation. So that's the overall argument. So let me say I'm very excited about AI technology and very positive because there are lots of opportunities for using it for the good, both AI and AI on robots, because AI will be used in all the future robots that you will see. Looking at, for example, the disembodied side of AI, so AI running on just computers, you could look at ways for AI programs to detect disease and find appropriate interventions early, to discover novel drugs, find novel solutions to transportation problems, help us manage our increasing knowledge, maybe by summarizing papers, take over cumbersome and scheduling tasks, and then many other applications. And when you put AI on robots, the applications might range from search and rescue robots that can go into nuclear power plants that had accidents and clean up the mess, to robots that collaboratively help you in flexible manufacturing settings, to robots for agriculture, transportation, aviation, space, all the way to assistive robots in elder care and healthcare settings, and personal robots at home, and lots of other applications of robotics. I think the challenge for us is to now have this larger discussion and to think about what we can do in order to ensure that this potentially great technology, AI and robotics combined, can be used for the good of humanity. Part of what I think is problematic is that there can be accidental failures with that technology, as can happen with other technologies. These failures can lead to unintended and potentially devastating outcomes. Let me give you an example. An AI program that might be used to optimize energy flow, right, through the power grid, may determine that it's best to cut off a particular section to optimize the power flow, leaving millions without power, because it wasn't explicitly stated that wasn't allowed to do that. A program that's intended to classify objects on the road, as you might find them now on autonomously driving cars, might be able to recognize certain objects, but maybe unlearns how to recognize these objects simply because of the continuous learning and the fact that these learned classifiers can drift, and that it might, over time, based on the context in which it continues to learn, confuse strollers and cardboard boxes, and maybe drive over a stroller because it knows cardboard boxes and other problem can be driven over. A household robot left to its own devices may decide to watch soap operas and learn interaction principles and ways to interact with people from soaps, which you might not want, right? Whereas it could watch crime movies, right, and think that that's the right way to interact. Or a robot with a built-in self-preservation mechanism, which is fairly common that we have these, doesn't act to save a human precisely because it wants to avoid its own destruction, even though we have empirical evidence now that people want robots to self-sacrifice in those cases. So what can we do to safeguard AI? I want to point out two sets of false starts, one that starts within the system and one that starts sort of from the outside on the regulatory side. Inside of the system, and these are all areas that people are discussing right now in the research community, you could look at ways to optimize the utility function, what the system is really trying to accomplish and achieve. Just build in the right goals. The problem is that the system might find a way, maybe even a very roundabout way, to alter its own goals and utility function. Maybe, as I mentioned before, you can add a big red button. That's the kind of thing we have on the robots in my lab. When the robot does something wrong, you push the button and power shuts down, and that's the end of it. Now, that may not be possible in the AI case. It may not be possible because maybe by the time you get to shut it down, disaster is stricken already. It may also be that the system may not allow you to shut it down, right? And you can think of shutdown leading to bad effects by thinking of an airplane, for example, which you cannot just simply shut down in midair, right? You have to really do graceful shutdown in a way that the plane still can land safely when something goes wrong. We could just not use certain algorithms, just outlaw them, right? Legally, prevent people from using them. That's a problem because individuals may still do that, despite the fact that they're not legal. Just think of computer viruses, right? Which are not legal, but people do that all the time. And malware. Maybe we should just train the classifiers the right way, right? Use the right kinds of learning mechanisms. The problem there is that even with some appropriate learning mechanisms, based on the data you have, you might exacerbate biases in the data, right? And distort the ground truth. Could also try to get at the problem from the outside, where we look at what we can do from a societal level. For example, we could demand that all the AI programs be open source and transparent so that we have access to the code. The problem is, knowing how the system does the learning doesn't tell you really what it has learned, and it may not limit what it can learn. Could also, as I mentioned before, just prohibit and outlaw certain learning algorithms. The problem there is that systems that are sophisticated enough might be able to learn how to learn. So they might actually be able to read a book on the learning algorithm that you outlawed and then do it, right? Run that algorithm on themselves. Could pass national laws to just constrain certain types of AI systems. The problem there is that adversaries may still use those kinds of systems, and that might lead to a situation where we're severely disadvantaged, where we give up critical advantages. Or we may want to limit, maybe legally again, the applicability of AI to certain systems and domains. But the problem there is that in an open connected system, even if one computer is not allowed to run a particular learning algorithm, it might be able to tap into other networks that can. So what kinds of security features can we have in these AI systems then? In many domains, safety and security is predicated on the idea that it is not possible without significant monetary investment and sophisticated technology to abuse the system. Take, for example, currency bills, where we have security features that are really, really difficult to replicate. That's why that works. It's not a sure-proof thing, right? But it makes it very, very difficult and hard to produce counterfeits. Note that the AI technology is very, very different in that sense. It's very easy to run computer programs on any side of hardware. It's very easy to run AI software on almost any type of hardware. There's no technological hurdle here. Moreover, machine learning programs incorporated in the AI system itself might actually be perfectly legitimate and safe. It's the way the system is embedded with the rest that might be problematic. Or it could be the data that the system is trained on is problematic. That could then lead to configurations of behaviors that are not intended and unsafe and difficult, if not impossible, to detect. The best way to safeguard AI systems, in my view, would be to really build in ethical provisions directly into the learning algorithms, the reasoning algorithms, the recognition algorithms, and so forth. Right? So in the algorithm itself, you have the provisions. However, in general, we do not get to control that. I might do this, and I might program my robots to have these mechanisms, and that's what we do in my lab, but somebody else might not do it. Even if it were legally mandated, it can be circumvented and ignored. Hence, I believe we need to make the worst case assumption. The worst case assumption is that you have an AI program that is written for a particular purpose by an adversary whose job it is to disguise the program's ulterior malicious motives. And then your task is to determine, treating this algorithm as a black box, whether the system has gone rogue. And that can only be detected, I would argue, through ethical testing specific to that system's tasks and context. But the AI system may not allow you to test it. It may not want to be tested, right? It may not want to be detected, right? Think of a recent car scandal where the system was specifically developed to detect testing and then fake the results. So really what we have to do is we have to do ethical testing that needs to occur unbeknownst to the system. The system, it must be set up in a way that the system has no way of finding out that it's being tested when it's being tested. And that, I think, requires hardware provisions and a special virtual machine architecture that can ensure that these ethical violations can be caught in time. We've laid the overall framework out in a recent paper, but I can show you a schematic of what such a system would look like. This is sort of the lowest level of the computing hardware with a minimal operating system. And between this and the actual operating system, which is here indicated as a virtual machine, you have an ethical core testing layer embedded, and it's on top of that upper virtual machine that the AI system runs, and it has no way of introspecting or correcting or interrupting this layer. And what that layer then effectively does is the following. At particular times during the operation of system S, it produces a duplicate version of that system S, which we know how to do in software using the virtual machine layer. One part of the system, S, continues to operate as before. The copy of it is subjected to ethical testing. And if the ethical test is successful, the copy is simply terminated and the system S can continue to run. If, however, the ethical test shows a failure, right, the system doesn't live up to the standards you want, you can terminate the copy, and then you can also terminate S. All of this, of course, has to be done in a larger embedded setting of policy directives. And from a policy perspective, I think if we were to pursue a picture as I sketched it, we would have to mandate of the hardware companies legally, right, that they have to add the necessary mechanisms to their chips so that all computers that use microprocessors that have these provisions built in. That's the technological hurdle we're looking for, because it's really, really hard to build on your own a microprocessor. So if you have AI code that runs on top of it, it can be caught. Of course, we need more research to flesh out the ideas and develop the details for the proposal I laid out here, all the way from the hardware to the various testing components. And we need to also look significantly more in detail into different methods, how we can incorporate ethical provisions already into AI algorithms, right? This is really sort of the hardware solution here, is a last resort method, but we want to catch these things as early as possible. The best way to do that is to build mechanisms into algorithms. And as I said, this is also in addition to all the legal provisions nationally and internationally to use our best practices for responsible and accountable AI software design, as well as legally mandating these built provisions in AI systems. Thank you.
Okay, Nasli, how are you?
Thank you.
Nasli Shuk. Long time active member of the school.
So we're going to step back a little bit and pick up where we left off in some of the earlier discussions about AI for government. And in this context, I'd like to draw your attention to a book that Michael Dukakis and his colleagues are putting together on the theory, pragmatics, and maybe possibly implementation of AI for government. So what I'd like to do, where does this work? Right?
Yes.
If not, I can do without it, just talk to you. Okay. So we have an issue. We have an issue here that has three parts to it. We have the AI part, we have the government part, and we have the challenge of connecting between the two, and then asking ourselves, well, where are we going with this? So my comments are presented in those three parts. So what's interesting about what we're doing here is that we recognize that the context that we are now in is a context in which we know much more about government. We've all had some course on government, some experience with government and so forth. Then we know about AI. And because it's a relatively recent part of our reality, by our, I mean the relatively educated community, the connection between AI and its uses for government becomes really an important challenge. So related to this is early on, we have to recognize that the world is a very different place. There are many, many diverse perspectives, countries, capabilities, and so forth. And it's very difficult to come up with general principles of performance and behavior in a world that's as diverse as it is, but we know we can do it because we've done it before. So let me go on now and start with the AI side. And I'm just selecting those. The outline was for my own good so that I stay on target. There's some aspects of AI that we would consider really, really basic now and for our purpose today. One is the near ubiquity. What is this? Well, let's see if we can do this down. Yes, that's the outline I wanted to work with. And we're at number 2, having to do with, let's look at AI, power and pitfalls for our purpose. So we've done that. I'm sorry, on the context, a reminder of the differences in capabilities. And I picked up robots because they're fun. And And this is a reminder of the diversity of the world that we live in, and that we have to remember that the freedoms of whatever capability we're talking about is varied throughout the international system. And that's part of the context that we're dealing with. So now we turn to AI. You know all of this, but each one of those carries some important implication. We know that there's near ubiquity in the use of AI in almost all aspects of industrial societies. And we know that many forms, manifestations, etc. We also know that there's a very diverse technical community. And then when we talk about ethics of AI, we recognize that usually, with the exception of our first speaker, scientists and technicians working in AI don't have ethics as a primary objective. They just want the machine to work and to do something interesting. It's not part of their job description. But there are two important aspects of the AI world that are absolutely fundamental for our purpose. One pertains to data, and the other pertains to algorithms. And I'm not going to tell you anything that you don't know, but I do want to remind you that in AI applications, data is usually embedded. And it's very difficult to get a handle on really what is a database, not really transparent, unlike usual statistical applications where you know what the source is and so forth. This is kind of important because if data, which is what we expect will be relevant to AI for government, then we have to have a sense of whose data, how is it embedded, etc., etc. The issue of algorithm is more interesting and more complex. There are values embedded in algorithms. I never thought of an algorithm as having values. I was so grateful that the algorithm works, whatever algorithm I was using. Still think about the value part of the implications. Values embedded in the then we are carrying not only uncertainties, but a set of values that whose content we may not know enough. Now, for most industrial applications, probably values don't matter. Just get the thing going, and that's all that matters, as long as the plane doesn't crash where it finds shape. But in the domain of government or governance, values become very important if they're embedded in algorithms. And at that point, the issue of transparency becomes important. And it's kind of thorny because the last thing we want to do as non-AI creators and technicians is to delve into algorithms. We want to be able to have a sense of what's going on without having to become really an expert in the area. This raises the question of where are artificial intelligence innovations happening? I can't vouch for this, but I found it very interesting because of the gradations and of the places that stand out as having high innovation. I was a little bit surprised at the distribution of the dark colors, but this is just as a reminder of the diversity in which we're operating. Now let's turn to government. And without doing a play on words, government is the mechanism through which governance operates. And the AI for government brings out the, one more time, the diversity that we're dealing with. This is the distribution of in countries by degree of economic freedom. Diversity. Now, the message here is the greens are the good guys in open, and the darker colors are not, in terms of control of government of economic activities. This has nothing to do with efficiency, or performance, or anything. It's just that element. And the reason this is important is that it's really relevant to remain in touch with the realities that we're dealing with when we talk about general principles of of government to which we want AI to help us. So standard political scientists think of government as having to deal with the stress or the ratio between the loads on it and its capabilities to perform functions. And there is some kind of consensus among political scientists that at the generic level, not the specific institutional level, but the generic level, for a government to be operationally effective, it has to have a set of capabilities which are listed here. This comes from Almond and Power, published in 1966, but provided us with a framework. So if we are applying AI to government functions, these are the generic functions. I've added security because they hadn't introduced it there. And we're familiar with each one of these. It's just written listed in a generic, not operational, not idiosyncratic term. So with that, we keep in mind that whatever governments have to do or want to do or can do, have the capacities to do, there's something else that we really have to consider, and that is the matter of rules. Rules have to be made, they have to be communicated, they have to have agencies to implement them, and on and on and on. At the operational level, then, the interface between AI and the government capabilities becomes the scotch tape that keeps them both together. Moving on to the connections, the AI and government. I started with some comments on AI, and then I moved on to some comments on government. And a reminder that the gains to government from AI are generally thought of, more efficiency, more consistency, better monitoring, and better possibilities of alignment in performance and goals, plus lots of others. This is just a reminder. Now here is a rather interesting situation having to do with the potential limitations of AI as we understand it, we being the social scientists for governance. We're very good at analysis and targeting using those logics and those technologies. But it's not clear that AI provides us assistance with interpretation of rules, regulations, etc. I'm pushing this tentatively because I think of that as a possible limitation, and I hope you can tell me that I'm really wrong. The second possible limitation is that very good at execution of tasks, meeting a target, meeting multiple targets. But not much work has been done on meeting a target and considering the consequences. For the government part, this may very well be relevant, important. Consequences create problems if we don't anticipate them, at least think about anticipating them. And now we put the two pieces together, which is AI for government explicitly. And what I want to do, what I would like to do, I really am almost done, is remind you of the experience we've gone through with the internet. We've had very interesting developments in our experience with the internet on architecture, on governance, and on technology. And I want to go through 1, 2, 3, because jointly, all three help us think about what can we learn for applications to government. We now know that the values that those are constructed, designed, developed the protocols for the operation of the internet drove the architecture. The architecture was designed for open systems, for reach. It was designed for extensive massive communication. It was not designed for high security. It was not designed for lots of other properties that we now think are important. And we are now recognizing the relationship between the problems we now have, some problems we now have, we should call cybersecurity, and the architecture of the system. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should have done a different architecture. What I am suggesting is that the relationship is important. And I also want between values and architecture and values, but I also want to draw your attention to the fact that NSF has completed a few years ago a large study about alternatives to our current architecture. So we're already thinking about, what can we do about that. Second lesson that comes from our experience with the internet is distributed governance for that particular technology, for that particular internet. Distributed governance is not standard in our textbook on government. Textbook on government is usually hierarchical, blah, 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 blah. But we don't value and we don't articulate what that might be. And yet we have constructed a global system whose properties are in fact of a distributed nature, and we're all dependent on each other. But what this does, that's very relevant, is that authority in that case comes from performance. So performance is a check on whether you're legitimate or not, whether there's authority or not. And then the third and last lesson or experience or insight you might get from the internet situation has to do with technology specifically. And that is the innovations in distributed interactions for a particular purpose that we now call, example is the public ledger. Transparent, overt, available, possibly very scalable, and may have potential for how to democratize. Now, we're not sure that a distributed public ledger works for all functions we're interested in, but we've never had this experience before. We've never had the possibility of running activities that we consider valued, Bitcoin, etc., in that domain, in that area, and it may not scale well, but it's operational. So what does all this amount to? It amounts to bits and pieces of what we might want to seriously consider when we begin to think of the prototypes of AI for government. So this brings us to some imperatives. All of this you're familiar with: responsibility, accountability, and performance, blah 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 blah. And the point of how can I go back? Yeah. No. The 3 points here that are not part of the usual. One more. Yeah, right here. We usually think about AI for something, but we may very well have to think about the provision of human oversight. It doesn't undermine the technological imperatives and the technological underpinning, but I, for one, am not comfortable enough to eliminate the human oversight. I'm not quite sure how it's to be done, but so then there are 2 footnotes here. So far, I haven't used the word feedback, and I don't think that the previous speaker also mentioned the word feedback. But in a government context, the feedback relation, the feedback dynamics between the demands on government and pressures on government and the potential corrective mechanisms by government, that feedback loop is one in which we could possibly be able to innovate improved responsiveness by government. And then the last point is trying to, it is imperative that we find ways of preventing the excessive centralized control of any entity in the use of AI for governance. So, what does this, let's see. What next? Where are we going from here? A reminder. In the world out there, there really is something akin to what we used to call an arms race. It's a competition, global competition for AI-related leadership. And this is true of our generation, but when the next generation is really trained in AI comes up, we're expected to see an acceleration of this. This is my last slide, it's back to robots again. And what we don't see here is the usual north-south cleavage in capability, and we don't see, we see some surprises. I did not expect Singapore and Korea to be more dominant in robot density than the United States. And I don't want to make a big deal out of it, but I do want to add that diversity is also manifested at the technical, at the operational level. So, to conclude all this, I suggest that we may want to think about these bits and pieces that I've shared with you as elements that have to be taken into account if and when there is serious international discussion about a global accord on a treaty, on the management of AI and respect for the ethics thereof. Thank you.
I think the Rotenberg family has been a part of my life since I started in politics. And Mark, have we met before this?
I don't think so, Governor.
Well,
You've met everybody else.
They're everywhere and they've been enormously supportive. So it's a real pleasure to present Mark Rotenberg to you, who is, among other things, the president of the Electronic Privacy Information Center. Welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to hear you.
Well, hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to be here today. As the governor mentioned, my family is from Boston. I grew up here, and I still remember, I think it was the winter of 1978 when we had that massive snowstorm, and you got on the television in a sweater and reassured us, and we went out and we went outside and had a good time. So those were good days. I'm going to try to get through a lot of material quickly. When I heard that you were pursuing a global accord on AI, I was very pleased. This is an area which, do you have VGA? I don't have HDMI. You must have VGA. Digital divide right here at Harvard.
Yeah.
Well, it's a keynote. It's not a PowerPoint. Well, you have a Mac there. No?
Yeah, one, but it's not the.
Does anyone have a HDMI to micro HDMI Mac adapter?
Actually, I don't know if it's Mac, it's HDMI and micro HDMI.
Okay, this might work. That might work. Isn't that HDMI? No, that's USB-C. Also USB-C.
Oh, HDMI to micro HDMI. It's HDMI.
Yeah,
That's
that might
micro
work.
HDMI.
No, that doesn't work. It's not a real shame because I have a good presentation.
Sure, we will figure that. They have it.
Okay, well, I don't want to take too much of your time. I'll just jump right in, and if we can get the slides to work, we will. But I'll begin by saying I started an organization about 25 years ago after I'd spent some time working for Senator Leahy on emerging technology and law issues, focused precisely on new privacy. No? Yes? I'm sorry? Yes, but it's a keynote. Can you display keynote? It's a Mac format. Right? That USB?
How do
How do I transfer to you?
the email? Excuse me. Thank you. Yeah, you know what?
I was gonna say that because around. That's why
Okay.
Sorry.
Can we plug that in?
Yeah, he'll get that, yeah. That's your.
Okay.
Congratulations. Yeah. Good save. Yeah. What do you ask for? Oh, that's great.
Okay, here we go. I'll talk more quickly. So as I said, we started an organization to focus public attention on emerging privacy and civil liberties issues about 25 years ago. We have a wide range of policy interests reflected in this word cloud, which is frankly much easier to write than an annual report. You'll notice in the upper left corner, one of our key themes these days is algorithmic transparency. Now, let me explain to you, we have no objection, of course, to the delivery of government services using AI techniques. But if you think about it for a moment, many of the debates around the deployment of AI techniques today resemble the debates associated with the use of computing technology in government agencies back in the 1960s and 1970s. And in fact, Congress did a very good job at that time with the insight of lawyers and technologists and public advocates and others in trying to craft a policy framework that enabled the adoption of automation techniques while simultaneously trying to safeguard privacy and fairness in government record-keeping systems. That's how we got the Privacy Act of 1974, which many states, of course, have followed. Now, it's always been my view that the core interest in the protection of privacy is not so much about secrecy or confidentiality, which is how we typically use that word. It's about the fairness of the processing concerning the data of the individual. Is this the right person? Does it reflect all the relevant criteria? Is it accurate and up to date? Have they been given an opportunity to challenge adverse determinations? All of these considerations, in fact, were considered by the Congress back in the early 1970s when it said simultaneously, yes, let's adopt computing technology to make government services more efficient, but let's simultaneously ensure that we have adequate safeguards to protect the interests of the individual. And it's this particular debate that we are hoping to carry forward in the current discussion over AI. Part of the problem, of course, is that as these systems have become more sophisticated, they have become more opaque. And I have discussions nowadays with very smart computer scientists, and I say, well, how are we going to implement algorithmic transparency? And they say to me, well, you don't understand machine learning or neural networks. You see, because in these complex systems, we actually don't know how the outputs are produced. We can't replicate them. I typically pause and I say, how do you feel about that? I mean, as a scientist, how do you feel about that? I remember being taught that one of the keys to the scientific method was the ability to replicate outcomes. We are literally creating today black boxes over which outcomes are produced, and the people who are responsible for these systems, including the engineers, say in effect, I'm okay if I can't prove results. These systems are widespread, and they have enormous impact on the lives of individuals. Everything from the admission to a university like this one, to employment, to housing, insurance, commerce, even access to knowledge. The way information is presented on the internet to individuals is determined by algorithms that reflect aspects that is known to the search company about that particular individual. And what you may see in response to a search query is not necessarily what someone else may see in response to a search query. So this is in effect to show you how opportunities are in fact lost to individuals through the use of such systems. I was astounded, actually, in the numerous privacy campaigns and lawsuits that we have pursued over the years, that even some of the most sophisticated organizations in the world themselves couldn't understand and assess how their techniques were being deployed. And this came out in the post-Snowden evaluation of the NSA surveillance techniques. And if you read carefully some of the judicial opinions in the exchange between the agency and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, one of the things you will find is the NSA conceding that they didn't know that some of their systems had the ability to gain access to the information that they were in fact collecting, which I think should maybe give us all pause as we think about the deployment of these systems. Well, I thought a lot about how to convey what I see as the central concern in this realm. And I think it is about transparency. I think it is about the right of individuals to know how automated decisions are made about them. And we have spent the last 5 years actually bringing a series of cases involving federal agencies and even the US Federal Trade Commission, asking, for example, how does the TSA decide to pick a person out of a line for secondary screening? Do you use nationality as a factor? Do you use gender? Do you use race? Do you use religious belief? Some of those factors are actually not permissible in the United States, because we recognize that when our government discriminates against someone based on their religious views or their race, that's impermissible discrimination. But it's actually impossible to make that determination without access to the algorithm. The other thing which we're aware of through our litigation is that these systems have become very sophisticated. There was one time, by the way, I don't know if it's still going on, I suspect every person in this room had a rating of 0 to 1, which is a determination that the Department of Homeland Security had made regarding your likelihood to commit a terrorist act. And that rating contributed to a decision about whether or not you would be subject to additional inspection. I don't mean to sound Orwellian about all this. It was actually a resource scarcity problem. It was borrowed from the technique to evaluate the containers that were entering the United States. And the Department of Homeland Security said we can only open 1 of 20 containers given our ability to police the ports. We will look at a variety of factors in the manifest to decide which of the every 20 containers to open, and then to port that technique over to individuals entering the United States to use similar factors to assign scores, and then to allocate resources to the greatest risk. It's not irrational. We have more recently actually looked at the spread of secret rating techniques in the private sector. I'm sorry, Governor, this may actually be a Brookline-based company called Universal Tennis Rating, which has developed a proprietary scoring technique for young athletes. Now, the purpose, I think, is quite reasonable. How do we take young athletes who play tennis in different regions of the country, participate with different leagues and different clubs, and match them up when they come together and assure that they're roughly equivalent skill? Now, in some sports, that's actually pretty easy. If we were talking about the mile, for example, we might say, well, if you can do a mile that's under 4 minutes and 30 seconds, you've qualified for this event. Turns out to be more difficult in sports such as tennis. Well, this company decided that the solution was to assign a rating to young athletes. It just wouldn't reveal the basis of the rating, the criteria, or the weighting. And we objected to that. We said there are actually other ways to solve this problem that don't require the use of secret techniques. Someone wrote a news story that said that we took a swing at secret tennis rating techniques. Okay. How do we talk about this in a way that the public understands? I will go a little bit more deeply in a moment to some of the policy options, but we have literally created screen cleaners, which we're going to leave with you, that say open the code, algorithmic transparency. Our theory is that you can't fix the code if you can't see the code. So we want people to look a little bit more closely at the code they're writing. We even have laptop stickers, Stop Discrimination by Computer and Secret Profiling. And the one that the geeks assured me was the most clever, although I don't still fully understand it. Bayesian determinations are not justice. Some of you are smiling, so I guess they were right. One of the other initiatives that we've undertaken, apart from the cases at Epic, is try to get the administration, which is now focused on the issue of AI in the US economy and AI in the US government, to create a public process that will enable public input into the policies that the United States produces. So the White House in May held a closed-door conference. They invited some business groups and agencies, and they created a select committee on AI, but there was no mechanism for public participation. We were actually surprised by that, because when President Obama undertook a similar initiative on big data, he was quite purposeful in trying to enable pathways so that the public could express its views. So we wrote a petition that was joined by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the ACM, the IEEE, most of the leading scientific societies in the United States, to the OSTP, and we urged public mechanisms for public participation on AI policy. And you see here the beginning of our petition. By the way, it's still open for signature. If you're interested in this, this is something we're always trying to push forward. We've continued to raise this message with the United States Congress. We think algorithmic transparency will be key, as well as public participation in policy formulation. Now I want to turn to the sort of the deep policy part of this brief presentation. And that's the opportunity that I believe is presented at the OECD to pursue the governor's recommendation for a global accord. I was very pleased to see, in fact, that earlier this year, I believe you had the Secretary General here and gave him an award. He's done outstanding work both to promote policy process with many of the leading economic countries around the world, and to encourage the participation of civil society. So we've brought many experts from academic and other communities to the OECD. The organization is also well known for the articulation of policy frameworks to address emerging challenges. These are typically 8 or 9 key principles, followed by an explanatory text that member countries support and can then be translated into national law. The OECD itself has no legal authority, but these well-developed principles have oftentimes been adopted by countries around the world and have framed legal rights and responsibilities. Perhaps the most famous is the OECD Privacy Guidelines of 1981 that can be found in laws in the US and in Europe and Asia and elsewhere. But as you can see, they exist in other areas of IT policy. And the current initiative at the OECD is around artificial intelligence. And I would say perhaps the best articulation the OECD discussion so far has, oh, well, that's my friend Gary Kasparov. So he's the world champion in chess, wrote a very good book recently on AI called Deep Thinking. He's also working in support of the OECD initiative. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is this set of principles that was put forward by the Japanese government in the context of AI policies for R&D, which have received a lot of interest, and consistent with the OECD guidelines, the Japanese government is looking to a set of simple principles that can be broadly understood and then implemented through law, through professional guidance, through industry standards. There is a positive vision in here. It is one of collaboration, but it is also one that recognizes risk and talks about transparency, controllability, safety, security, privacy, ethics, and then outreach to users, individuals, consumers, citizens who are ultimately impacted. The final point I want to make is, I think there is some urgency to this issue. I think for those of us who've been working in the field of technology policy, there's a sense almost that time is accelerating, that deployment takes place more quickly, and that the gap between informed government decision-making and the reality of our technology-driven world is increasing quickly, very quickly. And this gives rise to at least two concerns, and I want to leave these with you in addition to these really cool screen cleaners. The first is what we already know about the direction that the Chinese government is taking. And again, this is very rational. If you can gather lots and lots of data about individuals, you can rapidly automate processes, you can achieve new efficiencies, you can manage scarce resources, all of the things that government is constantly trying to do. What China is driving towards is a system where every single person has a number assigned, aligned with the interests of the government, and the benefits to the individual are proportional to the number. And joining the scoring system is the rapid expansion of data collection, because this is an unbounded technique. This is a story from just the past week. China's largest ride-hailing company, this is 90% of the market, by the way, is now recording in-car audio during passenger trips. The largest manufacturer of drones in the United States market is DJI, which is a Chinese firm, by the way. Now, if you're concerned that I'm sounding a little too nationalistic or anti-China, I actually have a warning, and this is my second warning to you, to the Chinese. I think the great risk here for all governments, even those governments that strive for efficiency within the boundaries of a constitutional democracy, is that they will ultimately lose control of these systems. And that is the warning for us from 2001. Highly advanced technology, wonderful ambition, but what was the ultimate consequence in that story? Sorry, David, I can't do that. I can't let you out of the pod bay. We'll come back at some point, I think, to how we understand Asimov's laws of robotics in our current era. But I do want to stress to you today how very important I believe it is to move forward on a project to establish algorithmic transparency and a set of framework principles for the deployment of AI that protects the interests of the individual. Thank you.
Our fourth speaker is Joe Nye, Joe Murray, who's been a stalwart supporter, participant, and creative leader in this little effort of ours. Great to see you.
Well, for better or worse, I don't have any technology, so there are no slides to worry about what system on. And also, I want to preface my remarks by making clear that I'm not in any way an expert on AI. What I know a little bit about is international politics and how states form agreements or fail to. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Tuan asked me to say a bit about the international and geopolitical dimensions of this, and I'm going to basically report on a meeting that was held in Aspen this summer of the Aspen Strategy Group, which I co-chair with Condoleezza Rice. It's a bipartisan group, and the topic was the international aspects of AI. And I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about what people discovered or concluded at that meeting, and with a comment or two of my own. One thing that was important that we started with, and this is a point that Michael Horowitz makes in an issue that's in the current article in the current issue of Foreign Policy, is as we talk about AI, it's very important to remember that AI is not one thing, and that it is a dual-use technology. It's not a weapon, and that basically we have to think about it in ways that are distinctive for AI. So before I make some of the comparisons I want to make sure that we understand that. We started out in the discussions at the Aspen Strategy Group about asking how was AI going to affect competition between countries, the global balance of power, and the international conflict, and so forth. And there, a great deal of attention has been drawn to the US-Chinese competition in AI. Xi Jinping has said that by 2030, China will be the world's leader in AI, passing the United States. Eric Schmidt, formerly of Alphabet, Google, who was with us at this meeting, said he believes that Xi is right, that China will be ahead of the US, or could be ahead of the US by 2030 in AI. And certainly that has very much caught the attention of the United States Congress, which has been trying to take a number of steps to deal with this. Now, and there was a very interesting paper by a British entrepreneur in AI, said that while he is a scientist and entrepreneur, did not think this should be polluted by the geopolitics of states, that if he stepped back and looked at the world today, he would be remiss if he didn't say there is an AI race. So there's a lot of steps the states are taking are based on this premise that there is a race for geopolitical advantage that is summarized by this Xi Jinping statement, and that leads to a number of policies. For example, one type of policy that might come from this is, to what extent do you want Chinese students in laboratories at MIT and Caltech? Traditionally, we have regarded the openness of our universities as essential to our free liberal system. But if somebody essentially takes the latest technology home in the wetware of his brain, and it helps China get a leg up on something, should that be permitted? Right now, of course, the Congress has passed a law updating the CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And the CFIUS regulations are being updated to prevent China and other countries, but particularly China, purchasing American startups, where they would be purchasing them not because of the great economic opportunity to exploit them in the American market, but because they want access to the technology and they're going to take it back to China. So Congress has already passed a law about this. Will they want to go further? Should we go further with other types of measures, such as restricting access for students or visas if they're going to compete in the area of AI? My own view on this is no, but it's an illustration of how the idea of an AI arms race and geopolitical competition in AI can have profound effects on our society. I mean, of what we think of as a free and open university structure. So on that, I might give you a quick summation of whether people thought this prediction was going to occur, that China will be ahead of it on AI by 2030, as Xi Jinping has expressed. The feeling here was that it wasn't all that clear. The general argument that people make is that since China has more data, simply more people, 1.4 billion of them, and since it has very little concern about privacy, I don't think it's a China edict as far as I'm aware, and therefore they're less constrained about the use of the data, and that China, therefore, when it turns machines loose to learn as machines, and to go deep into neural learning, which they can't fully explain, there are fewer constraints. Whereas in Europe and the United States, there will be constraints. Therefore, Chinese machines will develop more sophisticated algorithms sooner than the West. And that whatever measures we might put on about putting in a code with an ethical layer, such as Matthias was talking about, what makes us think China will do the same thing? And if it doesn't, will then China have this geopolitical advantage? The right post to that, or the opposite view, was the Chinese might be particularly good at AI for certain purposes, let's say mass surveillance, to go back to what we just heard. It doesn't mean they're good at all types of AI. And the interesting question will be whether a centralized system like the Chinese system will be better than a market system which has many entrepreneurs who will try many things that don't work, but nonetheless one of those things will turn out to be extremely important. An example of this is shale revolution in the United States, where the shale rock had always existed, and the technologies of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing were not new, but it wasn't the government with central direction. It was an entrepreneur in Texas who decided to stake his fortune on it, indeed almost lost it, and that basically unleashed the shale revolution. Will there be an equivalent in AI? The Chinese, with their central direction and concern about surveillance, will move very quickly in one direction, but there'll be lots of other directions which will be less politically attractive to the central authorities, and yet it will be one of those. Many of them will may be the particular breakthrough in a particular area. So in that sense, I think the conclusion of the group after talking about the AI arms race was it's uncertain. it's indeterminate, and that statements about China will or will not exceed the United States in AI by 2030, that will tip the global balance of power. Much too simple and it's very premature to make those sorts of statements. So that was one type of thing we looked at, which is this large geopolitical competition. Another thing we looked at was the question of, which we touched on a little bit this afternoon, which is, what about the idea of agreements or treaties which limited AI? There was an interesting discussion of what AI is doing to warfare, and clearly one of the things it's doing is unleashing the idea of swarm warfare, where you'll have massive numbers with a great deal of autonomy and offensive and defensive weapons. And the question of what will that mean for theories of just war, the laws of armed conflict, the distinction between civilians and military and so forth. And again, there are lots of worries about this. We looked at an article by Douglas France that was in the Los Angeles Times this summer, in which the article was entitled, "We've unleashed AI and now we need a treaty to control it." The interesting question there was that France said the key is to make sure humans remain in command, and we've heard that concern this afternoon. And so what we need is some international institutions like the International Atomic Energy Agency in the nuclear area, which will essentially monitor the various programs in AI in different countries. So we would have, in a sense, open inspection of algorithms. So we're asking, does an algorithm, does a chip have a layer, let's call it the ethical layer that Matthias talked about, and therefore can we get transparency in that algorithm? This International Atomic Energy Agency equivalent would have the job of inspecting those chips. But of course, the problem here is how will you know what you don't know? After you, how would you verify this? You might say, well, the IAEA on nuclear issues goes to declared plants and asks, have they misused their civilian nuclear facilities to produce weapons-grade materials? And so this international algorithm transparency agency would go and look at whether Chinese, Russians, and other algorithms that are being used in various systems, particularly weapons systems, have this, let's say, the ethical layer, or designed in such a way that they can be made transparent. But how would you know whether they had declared all their facilities? It's a little bit like the problem of North Korean nuclear weapons right now. North Koreans can say, we'll destroy a certain amount of nuclear weapons. How do you know about the ones they didn't destroy, or how many there are overall? So the feeling we had, the difficulties of verification made the treaty approach very difficult. I have recently been looking back at cases where the world has tried to cope with a new disruptive technology and asked what sorts of control mechanisms were reached internationally. And of course, the classic is nuclear weapons, which came on the scene in 1945. And there's a pattern here. The first effort was to have a big treaty in the United Nations. The United States fielded the Baruch Plan, to have international control of nuclear weapons. What's interesting is that the extent to which there's nuclear arms control, that's not how it happened. The Russians rejected that, or the Soviets rejected it. It wasn't until 1962, when you had the Limited Test Ban Treaty, banning that explosions in the atmosphere, that you had your first agreement. That's nearly 20 years later. And that, of course, was really as much about the environment as it was about weapons. And in 1968, you had the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And then in 1972, you finally had the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty between the two superpowers. So it takes a long time. And the first efforts are not ones which go to the heart of the problem. The other area I've looked at, and I've written a little paper that has been published in Cybersecurity, a peer-reviewed journal called Normative Restraints on Cyber Conflict. And what's interesting there, when you look at cyber as a precedent for AI, is it starts with the Russians going to the United Nations in 1998 and declaring that they want a treaty to cover all, they don't call it cyber, they call it information technology. The US resists that on the grounds that it's not verifiable. And, but we do agree to creation of a group of government experts under the UN auspices, which works for about a decade. There are several versions of it, but in 2015, this UNGGE brings out a report, which is quite interesting. It has some draft norms. Now, what does it do when it gets to the problem that it can't verify a weapons ban? It's impossible to really ban certain types of cyber weapons. The same code can be used as a weapon or a non-weapon, and it's dependent on the intent of the user. But you can't say ab initio, this is a weapon and that's not a weapon. So you can't say, here's a stockpile of weapons that you would ban. So what the UNGG did was, instead of focusing on the weapons, they focused on the targets. And they developed a set of norms saying you cannot target civilian infrastructure in peacetime. And they borrowed the normative structure on this from the existing laws of armed conflict, which make a distinction between civilian and military targets. And that was enshrined in the 2015 report of the UNGGE, which was later adopted by not only the General Assembly, but by the group of 20 most important economies in the world. The problem with it is that Russia, which signed it later in the year 2015 as a Christmas present for Ukraine, interfered with their electrical grid and shut down Ukraine's electrical grid. And then, of course, in 2016, they interfered with our election. And so even though the Russians had signed this set of principles, it didn't restrict them from their behavior. And that then raises the question which I address in the paper that I mentioned, which is, why do states ever pay attention to norms? Why do they ever hold back? In other words, suppose we got a good set of norms for AI, why would states ever restrain themselves? And I found three basic causes of why states sometimes, obviously not always, sometimes are restrained. One is prudence, that the unknown consequences of new technology, unforeseen consequences, and the risks that they may get out of hand can sometimes lead states to restrain themselves. So that you can develop a taboo, such as the taboo against the use of nuclear weapons, where we could never get an agreement on no first use of nuclear weapons, but you got in practice a taboo against first use of nuclear weapons. And that was a norm that was based on prudence and the danger of unforeseen consequences. A second reason that states will restrain themselves is reputational costs to their soft power. So for example, if you look at biological weapons, the Biological Weapons Treaty does not have any real verification procedures attached to it. If you are caught with biological weapons or suspect your neighbor is possessing biological weapons, you report it to the UN Security Council. Sounds pretty weak. On the other hand, the costs of being exposed on this are sufficiently great and the benefits sufficiently uncertain that states have not been developing massive biological weapons programs. And the third reason states sometimes will obey a norm is internalization. It may be that within their own domestic societies, a norm becomes popular. I take, for example, the experience with slavery in the 19th century, in which at the beginning of slavery, it was regarded as an acceptable practice, but by the middle of the century, it was not. And that affected the way a number of states behaved in terms of the recognition of the Confederacy or the non-recognition of the Confederacy at the time of the American Civil War. So I think what I would do in concluding this report is to say that previous experiences show us that norms can work. They can work because of prudence or reputation or internalization, but it takes time, decades. And the question is, do we have decades? The interesting issue here is, could these things speed up? Sometimes people talk about a Sputnik moment in international affairs, referring to the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957, which suddenly speeded up American reactions in terms of space. And there, the question, or I'll give you another example, is on this limited test ban treaty in 1962, it was speeded up by the fact that strontium-90 was being discovered in mother's milk all around the globe. And that was sufficiently abhorrent that people said, enough of this atmospheric nuclear testing. Didn't stop underground nuclear testing, but atmospheric nuclear testing. And is there an equivalent that might speed up things in this area? Who had Bruce says what will change this is deaths. That right now, the loss of privacy, the loss of the inconvenience of malware, even ransomware, is bad, but not bad enough that people are really strict about hygiene. But he said, when people start dying, or in fairly large numbers, that might change. And the argument here is that when people start hacking in self-driving cars, and this causes a lot of deaths, that might lead to a very different attitude, a Sputnik moment, if you want, or a strontium-90 moment. Another possibility that might do this in terms of AI would be, or particularly a set of weapons, would be if terrorists started using drones. We saw an effort to assassinate the president of Venezuela with a drone, but suppose it becomes widespread. I mean, these drones are not that hard to purchase. You know, they're not that costly. Suppose it becomes widespread, or suppose it becomes known that some of them can be autonomously oriented. Would that change attitudes in a dramatic way? I think as I look into my own conclusions on this, and again, I'm no expert on AI, but to conclude, I'd say that there are certain principles which are important to try to preserve. There is a group of government experts on the convention on certain conventional weapons, which meets in Geneva, which has been trying to look at autonomous weapons. I think that the types of things that we would hope for in the future is not a grand treaty, but various ways to develop norms. We've heard two very interesting proposals for a normative approach this afternoon. But the idea of human control of the loop remains important. The existing doctrine of the U.S. Defense Department is so-called man in the loop. That obviously has to be updated to human in the loop. But the problem is, what does that mean? And is it adequate? If you look at incidents like the shoot down of the KAL airliner in Hades, or the American shoot down of the Iranian commercial airliner, you can see that even when there were humans in the loop, systems provided information which led to large-scale deaths. So what are the ways in which you can try to create loops in which the humans can intervene at appropriate points? And that goes to what the American Navy is doing, which it calls graduated autonomy. Rather than creating a whole set of autonomous weapon systems, you make distinctions between situations where you want to reserve it for human pushing a button to situations where you are fending off a swarm of cruise missiles or drones attacking a carrier or whatever, in which you may want to have certain weapons which are largely autonomous and picking their targets and moving back and forth among the swarm of attackers. And so the question of how do you design that is important in difference. Similarly, you want to design for fail-safe systems which have expiration dates or limits. It's interesting, if you look at the Stuxnet virus, which was used against Iranian centrifuges, originally it was designed just to attack a certain set of Siemens controllers. Unfortunately, they played around with it and escaped in the wild, and the virus became more broadly available. But you can think of weapons which are very narrowly circumscribed in time or task, rather than, even if they're autonomous within those very narrow boundaries. And then I think most important is what we just heard from Mr. Altenberg, is that the degree of transparency in algorithms is crucial. In other words, the question of how do we know what's in these algorithms, there is always going to be the problem of have they declared everything. But nonetheless, the principle of pushing harder that more should be open and transparent seems to be a type of international principle that we would want to build into a code of norms if we ever get that far. So those are my conclusions from having spent time on this issue without being an expert, but putting it in the context of precedents in other weapon systems. And again, I would note that we seem to be at a very early stage of something which is going to take a good deal of time. And that raises the issue of, do we have that time? So let me stop there. Thanks.
We have some hand mics around. Hand mics. Oh. Joe, thank you very, very much, and thank you all. Lots of food for thought. The usual concerns as we deal with these kinds of issues, but that's why we're here. We have two of our fellows with us, and I wonder whether you guys might want to kick off the discussion by making a comment or two on what you've heard and some of the issues that they present to you.
Sure.
Who wants to begin? Walter?
Yeah.
Begin? Sir?
Shall I come
Okay.
over?
Who's gonna, we got a hand mic here? Got a couple.
Right there.
You go. Okay, so hello, I'm Walter Langelaar. I'm a Dutch person living in New Zealand. I've been in New Zealand for about 6 years now, and I think what's maybe interesting to mention, also in relation to kind of echoing several things that previous speakers also said, especially when Nasli referenced or commented on the differences in social structures or social cultural structures globally. While completely understanding Joe's perspective on the China example, in New Zealand, luckily, we have a very different situation. And for example, the AI project that I'm working on really benefits from an openness that is already instilled in a society. And where also, especially in today's context, similar to some of the topics that Mark was discussing, we have a different approach to these tools. So rather than talking about weapons, we talk about opportunities for implementation of artificial intelligence in government. And I don't mean to come across as naive, but of course, there are these more positivistic sides to explore as well. I think another aspect of that, which is really interesting to explore, is the fact that several of the examples that were talked about in theory, also again by previous speakers, I think many of these things we already have today. An interesting example is in the recent rollout of the GDPR in Europe, so the legislation surrounding, let's say the new privacy laws for people. There's a specific article in there, Article 22, that talks about the degree of openness, or at least the idea that as a citizen, as a human, you should be able to get insight into the algorithms that might be profiling you. So if you are getting profiled by an algorithm or an AI-based system, similar to how today you can, in many societies, you can request the data that a government or an institute has available on you. In this new legislation, you may also gain insight into how these technologies actually work.
You see legislation in New Zealand.
This is the new European GDPR.
Right.
Yeah. So I kind of there's other examples like that, of course, globally at the moment. But maybe I'll just leave it at that for now. And maybe another speaker could comment on this as well.
Sir?
Sure. Do people want to comment or do you want me to move on to something?
Whatever you want to say.
Okay. And I had prepared a few slides. I know we might be short on time. Should I just talk about my thoughts from my slides? Yeah, maybe if we have time for the slides, then I can talk.
Okay, well,
yeah.
we've got a good general Where is it? Gonna be on film? Ah, cousin, welcome. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's need to talk.
Go ahead. We're anxious to hear you speak.
The audio and the
You
video.
turn up someone to talk.
Go here. Where do you want
The audio and the video are both muted.
it? Here? No?
Đúng hình như là em turn off luôn.
No, he had to talk.
You can go ahead and speak.
Joshua, please talk.
Yeah.
Ah,
Please speak. Yes, please.
Let's have a robot speak.
can't seem to get through.
You see me?
What do we do?
You can go ahead and I can connect with you.
Yeah. Okay, so another people, he's related.
Okay, all right. Other comments, suggestions? Yeah. Tell us who you are.
I'm the Emilio Rabasa, General Consul of Mexico. Thank you, Governor Dukakis. I wanted to know if there is any awareness, particularly of our last speaker, Mr. Joseph Nye, about this UN resolution, which has been sponsored by 21 countries from all over the world, about the impact of rapid technological change on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, which has been discussed at all levels in the General Assembly, and it's now reaching the Technology Facilitation Mechanism of the United Nations to include in the program all the recommendations directed to governments, private sector, international organizations, civil society, academia, community, and what would be your comments on that? This is to encourage the forum and the commission to take into account the findings therein on this consideration. Thank you very much.
Joe.
My impression is that the work on this has been done largely in the Committee on Disarmament in Geneva, but that it is receiving attention and being discussed more broadly throughout the UN system. I think some of the American government people are skeptical about some of the questions of verification that are involved in it. But in general, I think it starts a process of discussion, which is a useful process of discussion. Whether that particular resolution is going to reach a broader consensus, I suspect not.
Who's next? Comment, question? Tell us who you are.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and I really enjoyed the meeting until now. My name is Padma Shri Sampath. I'm currently a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University, but in my day job, which I do when I'm not on sabbatical, I worked up to the last 2 decades on policy making in technology policy in the UN system. So as one of the previous jobs I've held was to lead an ECOSOC commission that leads or the negotiations and discussions and debates on the internet and different digital technologies. And also I've been actually one of the special rapporteurs of technology and science and technology issues for the SDGs agenda, which the colleague just referred to. So in my view, actually, I think that there's a certain geopolitical backdrop to this norm-making in the AI, which probably we need to attend to. The one thing, and I think that you referred to that partially in your talk, and I think that I mean, from the perspective of all countries, this debate is operating in the north-south context to a large extent because there are huge technological divides. And AI is operating in the context of what are the perceived benefits of this technology, what is the industrial application of these technologies, who gets to capture these benefits. Whether we say America or China, it doesn't really matter, or South Korea, but who gets to capture these benefits and who is providing the data input for the creation of these technologies. Now, what this does is that this actually distorts the debate on social and global and national responsibility for the development of AI-related applications, and where do we really extract accountability for it. And so the important thing in the global discourse is to move the debate away from the gains from these technologies and trade to to take a different approach to rulemaking globally, so to speak. For instance, this discussion, the technology facilitation mechanism, is an interesting example because I sit in this committee on automated weapons in Geneva, and they talk mainly about the risks of AI. But then by the time those decisions make their way to the technology facilitation mechanism of the SDGs, they become something else. They become about how countries need to collaborate and transfer technology, and for all gains in addition to monitoring the negative effects of AI. And I think that there's really a need to separate the two. And that comes from the fundamental problem, which I think a couple of speakers alluded to, which is that when we talk about AI, we talk about really innovation. We never talk about the ethics. And that sort of is a problem right from the bottom all the way to the top. And if we do not separate these things, we're not going to make any progress. I'm sorry to sound very negative about it, but really this is what I feel.
Joe, what do you say about that?
Well, I agree, but Natalie, I agree with what you said, but I'd like to hear Natalie.
What I wonder is, can we think of any technology where the debates and the issues at the global level started with the ethics? The ethics kind of get tacked on.
I can answer that. So if you take a look at the negotiations, for instance, on agriculture and food security, historically, if you take a look at the negotiations on agriculture, plant genetic resources, and food security, which also started after the Second World War in the United Nations, but it started from the perspective of ensuring the ethics and equality and access to everybody for genetic resources for food security. So now what we have is that although there's this huge movement with intellectual property, with the rise of plant genetic resources, biotechnology, and big companies, you still have a very strong ethical component to it, which gets co-discussed and which finds a place in this sort of political discussions. And that's not happening in the context of AI because people don't make the distinction between other kinds of digital technologies and AI. It gets sort of lost in this mishmash on digital trade, intellectual property, data protection. So it becomes a sort of a reflection of you're taking data from everywhere else. We don't have accountability of what data has gone into creating this AI. And now you're selling us this AI in terms of industrial application. And there are different kinds of market monopolies being created, and therefore we want to have a discussion about how to resolve that. But it doesn't become about what about the ethics of AI development. I'm not saying the former is not important. The former is very important because it increases technological divides. It also decreases the capacity of a large number of Asian and African countries to monitor these developments because they don't even know what's happening in these fields. But you have to make the ethics of AI a part of this discussion.
Go ahead.
I think there's a further problem here in the sense that, again, from a social cultural perspective, it's even worse because
Hold that mic close to you.
The perception, the popular perception on what AI actually is largely especially the one perpetuated through the media is mostly wrong. So a lot of technologies now are being lumped together and they're being labeled as AI, but technically a lot of these things are actually not AI at all. Right. especially in the design field. If you actually make things today that use, for example, natural language processing techniques with a front-facing chatbot, or the thing that people tend to call chatbots, technically or theoretically, those things are not really artificial intelligence. And amplify that by Hollywood-fueled popular opinion, people seem to have this perception of what AI is and what it's going to do to our world. But again, from a technical perspective, it's not really the same thing if you're trying to legislate on these things. In the last meeting here, also Jason Furman commented on this idea that artificial general intelligence, or AGI, we're really very far away from that, and the thing that now gets called AI, again, in popular opinion, people think that's what they mean. People really think that artificial intelligence is already at the stages that it's going to be able to do all these things, but technically that's really still quite a long way away. Yeah, and I'm actually quite interested in also in circles like these to further unpack what we're actually talking about, because to label everything AI or artificial intelligence, unnecessarily problematizes certain things, and it confuses the discussion, I believe.
Okay, I'm going to hold things for just a second, see if we can get our Japanese friends in here. Kazuo, you there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
I'd like to. My name is Kazuya. I'm in Japan. I'd like to add one thing to this discussion. I'm traveling this year. I'm visiting Dubai or Vietnam, Sri Lanka, and Korea, and many countries. And the level of AI, the technologies all over the world use AI. The technologies used in all over the world is very the same. It's interesting, unlike the conventional IT technologies like, Google search and other things, AI technology is quite shared, because all the information and all the source code of the basic technologies are shared by the IT, like archive, the site of the papers, the most recent papers and technologies are shared by those sites, and source code by Git are shared. And so the technology itself is quite there. Everybody can use. And of course, as a matter of fact, right now, the state of the real business and real deployment is now just started in real businesses. And of course, some of the earlier, cyber services like e-commerce and others, there are a lot of use cases, but in general, the technology is quite different from conventional IT technologies. Everybody can use exactly the same thing. And so the important thing is everybody should to know what AI really is. And as the previous speaker talked, there is a very big difference in understanding the real AI and what is described by the Hollywood movie. And so the education of the real AI and the principle of AI is much easier than the principle of the computers, like Turing machines and von Neumann architecture. The principle of AI is quite simple, that tune the parameter to adjust, to predict what we can observe in past data. So it's quite easy. And so the role of education, especially for the government, is very, very important in this regard. Just like the increase in the literacy, conventional literacy, was a very big issue in companies and government in last century. But this is in this century, AI literacy and making AI-ready people is the very big responsibility for the government.
Mark, hold on.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a few brief points. Coming back to the question about ethics and AI, this is an enormously important topic, and I wanted to mention that our organization is hosting in Brussels in October a meeting for the privacy commissioners, and our theme is AI, ethics, and accountability. And I think Turan will be there, and it's our effort to try to bridge a divide between the privacy regulators and the discussion about ethics. A second point to Joe Nye's description of the reasons that countries might choose to comply with a norm-based policy framework. I would say there's also a market-based reason, which we see in the realm of data protection and the GDPR, which is that the Europeans have said, in effect, if you don't comply with these standards for the processing of the data of Europeans, at least, we can limit your ability to participate in our markets. And if you see algorithmic transparency as one of the requirements within the GDPR, which is what Article 22 does, then you actually have a powerful market-based mechanism, at least for the private sector, to say, if this is the requirement for us, perhaps we'll comply, much as companies that are offering food, drug, and transportation services in the US have to comply with the requirements of our own regulatory agencies. And I wanted to make a final point about Jason Furman's comments regarding general AI, or what's sometimes described as the singularity. I agree that at this moment in time, this is far off science fiction, good material for Netflix episode. But I wouldn't underestimate that significant risk. If you think about issues like climate change, for example, we see a traditional curve, but with technology enabled dynamic, it looks much more like an exponential curve. And to the extent that machines do become smarter more quickly, that process is likely to accelerate. And so I think we need a good understanding now of what that risk looks like, even if the time frame today may be 20, 30, or even 50 years off. That could still be catastrophic.
Thank you, Governor. Philippe Lecor, Kennedy School. I'm going to move aside slightly from AI. My distinguished neighbor might not like this, but I'm interested in the geopolitical aspects of this. And I was struck by the sentence by Joe Nye about a possible algorithm transparency agency. What if they have not declared anything? And I'm just wondering, thinking about the Sino-American relationship, or perhaps the long-term relationship between the West and China, whether things have not already been set. When you look at Chinese companies in the telecom industry, for example, Huawei in particular, the way they've been treated in Australia or in the US or in the UK, even in the UK, which actually was much more lenient perhaps than the others, they are basically assuming that Huawei is providing backdoor information to the Chinese authorities. So I'm wondering if people around this table have information about AI and how it could work, and whether this suspicion of what another country, I'm thinking of China in particular, what it would be like, and whether things have not already been said, that this is the conflict that is going to happen in cyber, in telecom infrastructures, and also in AI.
Who wants to respond? I'm greedy. Down there. All right. Sorry.
Thank you, Governor. Been listening to the conversation. Several things I want to point out. First of all, back to Dr. Nye about the military from the United States Naval War College. Today, every person from the lowest rank to the highest, it is reinforced that there is a process to define an order to bring it to the attention and even question the ethics of an order that is given that might seem unethical or to harm people who may be innocent and not an adversary per se. That is reinforced throughout the military today, which is really important as we become much more technologically focused military.
Explain that a bit. John.
Yes, sir.
What does it mean?
Well, it's for instance, we had some of our people who come through the War College had a soldier in their platoon, the Army, and he used a laser and was pointing it at a local Afghan farmer in the eyes, pointing the laser in the Afghan farmer's eyes. And so that was definitely a violation. He questioned what he was doing, said, why are you doing this? He said, first of all, it's not ethical as well as illegal. It defies principles of laws, rules of engagement. That is a simple example at the lowest levels. And I think we can look from the news media that there's been resistance at the top level against some of the orders that have been given in recent weeks and months in respect to military action as well. It's important not just to look at the, what is legal or illegal, but also what is ethical and unethical, and to call that into question.
And our military folks are.
Yeah, it's very important. Yeah, I teach ethics of technology, and at the War College, we have a graduate certificate program, Ethics of Emerging Military Technology Graduate Certificate. We have 17 candidates in the program at this point, and they're researching various aspects of technology from AI, certainly, nanotechnology, information technology, food biotechnology, you name it, anything that can be weaponized, we're looking at, and they do in-depth research projects. Also, Undersecretary of Defense Kerner was up this past summer, and he stressed the importance with a new AI group that he has just formed, that ethics is essential to what they're doing in the Secretary of Defense's office. And next week, I'll be attending a conference at Georgia Tech, which will have a number of Secretary of Defense people there. The new AI director, the CIO, Office of Naval Research head will be there, and the topic is defense, AI, and ethics. This starts on next Wednesday and Thursday. Another aspect, a few years ago, a colleague of mine who runs an ethics center, the Marklet Center at Santa Clara University, was telling me he received a call. It's right there in the center of Silicon Valley. He received a call from a major company there, and the individual who called and said, I have some of the brightest, smartest code writers anywhere in the world. He said, but I have one big problem. They're all young, and they have hardly any ethical thinking and reason. And as a result, he contracted with the company. Now, this is unheard of for center directors. In that year, they did $800,000 worth in fee for services and ethics education with this group. Most centers that do fee for services, they're lucky to get $1,000 in a year. So I think this is really becoming a important topic. It certainly is with the military. And with the conference board as well, we talked, the Global Business Conduct Council, and I let them know, I said, national security is no longer the Defense Department's problem. It is your problem every company's problem because it can be used against you. It can help destabilize your company, the disruptive technologies. And so we all have to be a part of the conversation. So those are some points that I felt that are important to point out. We were fortunate last week to have Matthias to speak to our group as a lecturer, and certainly stimulated a tremendous amount of discussion on ethics and AI and embedding ethics. So it inspired some of our students to take that topic and light on that in the next few months of research. Thank you.
Let me ask you something. Who
Yes,
is driving this inside the government? I mean, for example, in the Pentagon, where is this ethical sensitivity? And use that
Well,
term.
other
Where's it
than
coming from?
Secretary Kernan making the ComEx recently at our conference, CWAC conference, we picked it up at the War College. I established the program. We're in our third year now. To my knowledge, no one else is. We're looking, I hope to find out more about that this next week when I'm with the other government officials.
Joe, any idea?
Well, it starts at the top in the sense that Secretary Mattis has got to approve this. In the prior administration, Ash Carter was concerned about it, and so was Deputy Secretary Bob Worth. So there is an awareness at high levels.
I was going to read.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Right here. Good. Tell us who you are.
Hi, thank you. It's Elliot Wyman with AI World. So in preparation for this effort we have with you and AI government, we read the National Defense Authorization Act, which you probably know. And I noticed that I noticed the wording actually says there's two parts to the National Defense Authorization Act. And the first portion calls for the Secretary of Defense to create a strategic plan and coordination of the Department AI effort, which I think you're referring to. And it says literally in there that that the emphasis on accelerating, scaling, and synchronizing Department of Defense activities through public-private partnerships while ensuring strong commitment to military ethics and AI safety. So it seems to be law now, which is good. And the other thing I just wanted to mention, you talked about some of the young AI researchers that haven't thought about ethics, but in my travels, I hear a lot of startups who don't want to work for military contracts. So there's a tsunami effect, I think, that's happening. And I think maybe part of the pressure on the defense to incorporate that thinking, and governments perhaps, is because they want to get the best people. On the other hand, obviously, they're going to fund some of these efforts. So I was going to ask you, Joe, this is definitely a dichotomy there where the government is funding it in the arms race. On the other hand, they're also trying to say at least that they're looking at and considering AI ethics and where and how that belongs, which might set a good tone for a lot of the work that's being done here.
I'm Alan Citron from Industry Risk Masters. I wanted to comment, I think, to address Philippe's question. It was a few minutes ago, so I hope I'm on target. The question had to do with the geopolitical potentials or impacts of AI. One to be considered, and there are two very current data points, is that AI is being looked at potentially as a form of verification for international cyber attacks. There are two specific data points. One is Apple announced last week that the fourth most downloaded app, Adware Blocker, is actually not an adware blocker, it is spyware from China. And the reason they could not figure it out is because there are so many different apps that have authorization, they can't police everything. And so it's through AI techniques, they're trying to expand the scope of what they can police. And hence they found it through experimenting with AI techniques and finding behaviors. A similar type of data point is what the government and many others are looking to Cisco now. Cisco has been pioneering the use of AI in cybersecurity. And what they're basically dealing with is the fact that because of the rapidity with which cyber attacks mutate and new types respond, no human being can keep up with it until after the fact. And so they're using AI to try to infer suspicious bit patterns. All of these have geopolitical consequences, and to Professor Nye's point about the inability to verify, this creates perhaps the greatest opportunity at this point, foreseeable opportunity, to verify behaviors.
Thank you. Well, my name is Armando Gil. I'm a fellow at the Berman Klein Center. I'm from Colombia. Well, thank you, Governor, for this opportunity. It has been very, very interesting to hear. All these opinions. From the Colombian perspective and South American perspective, of course, we have this challenge because we're dealing with many countries with low state capability, fragile states, and having this kind of technology we consider can be quite disruptive. And we would like to hear your opinion. I know that we have been considering state capability and the impact of AI. And we would like to know what do you think, especially in countries, for example, where we are already we have already conflicts and violent conflicts. One of our biggest threats is that, for example, drug dealing cartels are able to use this kind of technology, and that can be, of course, a big threat. And then we answer to these threats also using AI for military and defense purposes. And that's one of the things that we would like to know, how can, in some point, cooperation, but at the same time, there be some control over the use of this technology in countries in which we have, as we have mentioned, low state capability. We have heard about many legal answers, but these other states where laws are very difficult to implement, to follow, to actually, and to have a good level of compliance. So it will be very interesting to know their opinion on this regard, and considering the effects it will have in ongoing conflicts and in the threats for security that we have in the region.
Well, let me ask you this. If Europe is attempting to deal with this, what about the Organization of American States? Well, why aren't they doing it? What do you think? Seems to me it's a pretty logical thing for them to do.
Yeah, I think they're trying to look for some answers. I think we all have the same challenge that we're trying to define what AI actually is, how can we have some control. And I think there are good, well-intended people trying to work on this. But the thing is that I think we're looking at, for example, at GDPR, a very interesting project. But I don't know if we are considering the capacity we have to implement many of these these regulations. Yeah, we have been even having trouble to implement general data protection laws, for example. So having something like GDPR in our countries, we have to consider, I think, the context, and we're learning from international experiences. But I don't know if we are also considering the way these states are even working now. Even these organizations have tried to deal with different problems, such as Venezuela, for example, and they have been having difficulties working with this. And it is because there is a lack of cooperation, but at the same time, there is not understanding of many of the issues and how to implement proper policies. I think there are very good policies, but implementation has been quite complex in the region, at least.
So Joe, might there be a role for the international community in assisting regional organizations deal with this? And if so, who would do that?
If you look at, the UN structure has various regional components, which is one way of doing it. The other is a non-governmental approaches. Various foundations and organizations provide assistance, ICT for development. So I think you're going to find there's not one answer to that. There are going to be multiple answers to it.
Who's next? The deference to the Greek American community. This is our concept.
Yeah.
I would like to praise your efforts, Governor, because I think the importance of this conference is that it brings higher to the agenda the issue of AI and the rules that have to regulate its governance. Everybody spoke about AI, but not about the ethical aspects of its use. And I think that this sort of initiatives have to continue. We should also, or you should also continue them if you can globally, maybe transfer them in other geographical spaces, because it is an issue that affects us, affects everything. I think it is the issue globally. It affects security, geopolitics, it affects our democracy with the way, with all these cyber threats, but not only through that, it affects also the job creation, and there will be a new rise of populism due to the loss of jobs because of the automatization that is linked with the AI. So I think that it has many risks and opportunities, but it is the timing of your effort. It's really very appropriate.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Tell us who you are.
Yes, I'm Hyun Jin. So I'm a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Some of the questions were about AI in conflict situations, and I think another important dimension is how authoritarian governments really try to utilize that to oppress citizens. And I was in Beijing this summer to teach social media, and we all know that they use WeChat, but it has so evolved so much that they, instead of using multiple social media platforms or digital communication technologies, they rely on one platform. Of course, that makes it a lot easier for government to control and see what their citizens are doing. And as we all read from news media articles, that there are surveillance cameras all over, and now all information is incorporated for the governments to better kind of triangulate information about their citizens. So and this is an important aspect I think we need to think about as well.
Who else? Yeah, Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Cotterill. I'm a college fellow and a lecturer in the Department of Psychology here at Harvard. I teach courses on psychology of income inequality and social protest, so I'm interested in the psychological angle. I also use machine learning in my research, so I have an interest in kind of the under the hood mechanics. And I just wanted to return for a quick second to a comment that was made about education, and I think this is really critical in terms of promoting public engagement. And also I think it gets at some of these ideas about opening up code, right? And opening up code is wonderful from the perspective of people with expertise in these areas can have a look at it and hold people accountable. But that is a very small minority of folks, right? So in terms of promoting public engagement, I'm not convinced that that will be sufficient, right? And there was a study done by the Royal Society in London using participants in the UK, assessing perceptions of machine learning, and not a single participant in the study had even heard the term machine learning. So that gives a sense for the gap that we're working with here. How do we deal with that? What would be a great approach, or what would be a kind of a way to get our foot in the door in terms of public engagement? One thought is, if you teach undergrads, one of the first strategies you kind of learn is start with kind of applications, right? Start with real world examples, and then move to the under the hood mechanics. And I think the same principles could work here, meaning people might not know the term machine learning, right? But most people have some sort of familiarity with applications of machine learning. So they've logged on to Amazon or logged onto Netflix and had products or had movies recommended to them on the basis of what they bought or what they've watched in the past, right? I mean, we can use that kind of those familiar experiences as leverage, as a way to kind of get our foot in the door, to get people engaged, get people hooked, and then kind of progress to maybe the more under the hood mechanics. I think that this point about public engagement is really important also because how do we hold governments accountable? Well, one way, we've heard great ideas. Another way, of course, is if we can keep the public informed, right? We can get people to hold leaders accountable. So, and then actually one more thought on that is, okay, of course, engagement matters in terms of making sure people feel like they're a part of the conversation. And we know, from the psychology of social protest that one of the strongest predictors of collective action and civil unrest is when people feel like they've been left out or left behind in some sort of way. I think this is, relevant here in the sense of, AI is leading to lots of job displacement, right? But also in terms of if people aren't aware of, the term machine learning, then they're being left out of the conversation. So I think we have to care about these things from the perspective of political stability as well, right?
I'm very good at presentation, and we introduce your presentation in the website.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to speak to that last comment, which I thought was very important. And of course, education is an area that's being transformed by the mass collection of student data. And a lot of decisions are being made about students based on that data, and oftentimes through secret algorithms or proprietary algorithms. And people say, well, I mean, we could disclose these things, but of course, could a family or could a student make meaningful assessment? And I think that's a real challenge, and yet at the same time, I do think it does open the door to an independent assessment and to accountability, which is very important when these decisions are being made about individuals. I'll use another timely example. As you know, there's quite a lot of concern about the manipulation of public opinion on social platforms through advertising. And so the question arises, well, why did a Facebook user receive one ad and not another ad? And what was the source of the ad? And who was the sponsor of the ad? And which demographic groups were targeted to receive the ad? And for a period of time, Facebook was reluctant to release that information. They said, well, that's part of our business model and that has some proprietary value. But they were pushed, as you know. And eventually they did actually make that information available. And so now there's a big database and it's possible to go online and to be able to track advertising. Now, of course, you or I probably do not have the ability or the time to sort through all that. But there are groups like ProPublica, for example, that have become quite expert in using these large data sets to try to assess precisely those types of practices, how information influences the public on social platforms. So I think it's important to keep in mind that transparency as a general proposition still remains key in the debate. How it's implemented and who has the ability to make use of it, I think will be a difficult question, but not a reason not to pursue it as a goal.
Could I just add, on what Mark said, I happened to have gone to a talk yesterday at the Kennedy School about an algorithm which was being used to predict recidivism, which was thereby used to determine whether prisoners got parole or not. It turned out this algorithm was about 50% accurate. Talk about things that are immoral. And what's intriguing is that the inaccuracy of this algorithm, and therefore its exposure, and therefore it's being dropped, was by not a prisoner, but by ProPublica. So it doesn't have to be that the student or the family can themselves find out. It's that if the algorithms are transparent, it means that an advocate or an organization can hold them to ethical standards. So that was just a concrete example of what Mark was just saying.
And not to get off on this because I want to kind of, I'm friends, but let me ask you something. All of you know a lot more about this than I do, but determining whether or not an inmate should or should not be granted parole involves a lot of things. And close observation, conduct of the past, this and the other thing. Should we be using algorithms to do this?
Well,
Are they capable of doing it? I don't know, seems to me we're concerned whether or not somebody's gonna be given his liberty in advance. Awful lot of factors are there, and a lot of this has to do with human interaction and a whole variety of things. What do you think?
Well, in a sense, we do today because we have federal sentencing guidelines.
Right.
And those are rules that are designed to ensure fairness in our criminal justice system so that comparable circumstances produce comparable sentences. And there's a question, of course, for judicial discretion, and judges themselves don't want to become robots. They want to be able to look at a factor that maybe the sentencing guidelines don't consider. But here's the key distinction. The sentencing guidelines are public, and they're derived through a public process, and they can be changed if we're not happy with them. The proprietary techniques, for example, that are used by prosecutors to evaluate the credibility of DNA evidence are secret. And so you have an expert who comes before a jury and says there's a 92% likelihood that the suspect committed the crime. And the defense attorney said, well, I would like access to the technique that produced the 92%. And the company says, in effect, well, we can't reveal that to you. That's, you know, the basis of our business. And that's the line that I think we are at risk of crossing in many areas of the administration of government services. It's one thing to have a rule, which could be very good. It's quite another thing to have a secret process.
Okay.
Who's first?
You go.
Thank you. I
Tell us who you are.
I'm sure. My name is Anthony Bent. I come from K through 12 public education. And I'd just like to pick up on the notion of public engagement, because I think one way that we can do that, of course, is through pre-K through 12 education. And I'm not believing right now, after a long career and currently very active. Matter of fact, I just spoke to the executive director of the Superintendent's Association and several members on the board of Mass Computer Using Educators. They have a conference coming up in November. This is not part of the conversation in any kind of a robust way. So it seems to me, actually the question that I have is, do our speakers see any role for this kind of increase in public education through, or public engagement through K through 12 education? And then secondly, we have multiple countries here. I'm wondering, particularly in Japan and Colombia and Mexico was here as well, whether or not there's any of this kind of discussion and curriculum in those countries as well. Because I'm pretty active in my field in Massachusetts, and this is not a robust conversation to the degree that I know. Secondly, I think the interaction and the intersection with ethics is particularly ripe for secondary education in our schools. And again, I'm not seeing it yet. And I feel the need to broaden this conversation into our education system, because the stakes are very, very, very high. And I don't think our general population is aware of it. And we have a table of people who are in every way elites around this topic. And that's not enough for us to deal with this as a society.
Any thoughts about this? Yeah.
I found that very, very interesting. And I speak now from the perspective of a person who also comes from a developing country. And I think that this is the problem of our education system. It's the problem of the political system, because there is a lot of emphasis on using the internet, on using new kinds of devices for education, but there's absolutely no emphasis on teaching children or adolescents about the ethics of using these particular technologies or certain applications. And I think that's a really big problem. But that also gives me a segue to talk about something that I've been thinking about while we had the discussion, which is that an interesting issue in the topic of AI and governance that we haven't probably discussed as much until now, when you look at it from the perspective of developing countries, is that Governance has many problems. I think, like my colleague Armando pointed, that weaker institutional setup, so it's corrupt. Okay, so if you could have AI in governance systems, you could extract actually greater accountability from it. It could be, if you could design good systems with AI, in fact, you could eliminate certain corrupt practices in government functioning, you know. But that's also another debate that we don't have. We don't have this debate on AI to promote public welfare, or the limits and the strengths of AI in increasing this kind of transparency and accountability of public services.
We do in New Zealand, though.
Yeah, and I'm talking about developing countries. I'm talking about India or Asia, or Africa. This is what I'm talking about here.
I would like to expand this to in a way the other side of the spectrum, which is similar to what Mark earlier mentioned about indeed general AI still being a real thing. And obviously, I fully agree with implementing more strategies to get more awareness and educational perspectives on artificial intelligence. I work in education myself. We teach AI in my department, which is a media design department. So we teach machine learning and artificial intelligence tools and techniques to young and upcoming designers, which is really interesting. But what's interesting, like I said, on the other end of the spectrum is the fact that we can already see in certain engineering circles, for example, in aviation engineering, the idea that to get proper certification on artificial intelligence tools and techniques, similar to what Matthias was saying in the first talk today, we don't actually know what these things are doing. The deep learning networks and those algorithms layered on top of each other, like a human cannot interpret properly anymore what those outcomes actually are and how they were constituted. And this leads to the assumption that to do certification on artificial intelligence, you actually need more artificial intelligence. So in other words, only AI can certify AI. So that's like just to throw that idea out there. It's a bit, like I said, it's the other end of the spectrum, but similar again to what Mark was saying earlier about general AI, like that if those kinds of approaches compound, we very quickly might find ourselves in some undesirable situations also.
Okay, Dick, I want you to have a chance to.
No, that's okay. My topic got covered 20 minutes ago.
20 minutes ago. Okay. Our friends today on World. Comment or two?
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing. I mean, transparency means that you have to know what's transparent, and most systems just don't know what's transparent. So how do you regulate transparency when you actually don't know what's in the system? And that reminds me of a conversation in Canada that I had with one of the foremost machine learning experts in the medical field, Dr. Russ Grenier of the University of Alberta. And for folks here, a lot of the AI machine learning actually got developed at the University of Toronto. And actually, they're one of our sponsors, the whole Canadian government. And they're a great example of a government that actually cares about all of this and is actually doing something, but that's a different point. So I asked him, what is the reluctance in the medical field, because he works with doctors in hospitals all the time, about adopting AI. And I asked my personal doctor, who happens to run 300 at UMass, 300 doctors who work for him. And that gets into the point of AI, other than the Hollywood AI, and not to discount the fear of AGI, but AI over the next few years will be really moving in the direction of augmented intelligence that's helping people make decisions. And in order to help people make decisions, you need to either give them the final decision process, but you may not be able to tell them exactly why. And that's to your point, right? So doctors, for the most part, right now have this massive fear of letting machines tell their patients what's best for them, even though the machine learning experts can prove that the predictability is much higher than the human predictability historically. So the machine learning folks say, well, can you explain why you have a record of 50% success, but the machine seems to have a historical ability to do it at 91%? and doctors can't always explain why they make decisions either. So it's a very complicated situation. My final point is that all of this discussion kind of raised these bubbles right to the top, and why, you know, I think the efforts that you're doing, particularly with the efforts in security and ethics and regulatory issues in government, are perfect right now for what is required to get people together in a bigger way and amplify these messages to try to come to some, accelerate this process.
What's your sense? Is that beginning to happen?
Yeah, well, yeah, so this gets back to the earlier conversation about how fast, I think Mark said it, AI is accelerating beyond any other kind of, you know, tsunami that we've seen in technology. And Goldman Sachs reported at our event that there's been more money and investment, money spent on AI way beyond any kind of technology they've ever seen, right? And that's continuing into this year. So it's shrinking, the timeline's shrinking, and these, what I hear are, there's a confluence, a convergence of ideas, but people seem to be doing things. IEEE has an effort, AAI has an effort, the ISO and the Electronics Association are creating their own standards around certain aspects of enterprise AI and APIs. So this is happening very fast. So our hope is that we can bring a lot of these standards bodies and the ethics bodies together in one place, because otherwise it's happening all over with very hard to converge these ideas. So we're going to be very happy to be able to publish a lot of these proceedings and get it out to our 1 million people that we reach, and hope that this accelerates everything we're doing. Yeah.
I must say, if the public schools aren't into this in the way you suggest, this is very troubling. I mean, these kids are using these technologies all over the place. I can't keep track of them. But if we're not dealing with the ethical side of this, and appropriate conduct and all that kind of thing, we got some work to do.
I just want to add one thing. So last year I met with Charlie Baker and his Attorney General, and my school system where my kids are at in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, we have a program to help try to accelerate this technology, bridging the gap between elementary schools all the way through the middle schools and the high schools. There's a great superintendent out there. Shrewsbury is ranked 120th.
I'm superintendent there.
Oh, Joe Sawyer?
Joe Sawyer, he succeeded me.
He's amazing, right? Oh,
he
he
is
did?
amazing.
Oh, so you're from my town. All right, great. So I talked to him about a whole program to help accelerate technology innovation, right, from the kids in school, because my kids are like that. We're learning stuff.
That's awesome.
You know, all this stuff. So we had this whole year-long project. It is really hard, and I'm not even going to get into it. I'd love to talk to you about it, because maybe you can help me, to actually change the curriculum or introduce new programs in a state-regulated school system. And Joe wants to do it.
It's easier to move a cemetery.
You got it. I don't know what to do, so that was right before I was starting the AI world. I said, Joe, I got to go do this business. I sold it earlier this year, and I have so many people that want to help. And Charlie Baker, when I met him, told him about this, he said, great, come back to me and let me know how you did it, and we'll scale it up. So I would love to talk to you about it.
When Dukakis was there, we encouraged this kind of thing, if I may say. Couple more comments, then we're going to wrap up.
I'll make my comment very short. I think you raised a very important point. And I teach digital media courses at a university in US, and in college courses now, the ethics is almost kind of required topic within digital media courses. But in the secondary education, I don't think that is the case. I'm originally from South Korea, and I continue to do research on digital media use in South Korea. And in South Korea, nonprofit organizations play an important role in providing ethics in AI or digital media. So they develop some sort of content and materials that teachers can use in their courses.
I spent 16 months in Moonstown from 1955 to 57. Final comment. Fred of Columbia.
Very short comment, and I think it's also important to consider these new projects that are come to be known as AI and inclusion. I think inclusion is something very important. There are some interesting projects going on, and inclusion, I think it's a very complex concept and subject, but at the end, what I think it's trying to achieve is AI in order to consider, like, to achieve fairness, to consolidate democracy, to achieve peace in stable and fragile states, and that's something I think we should also consider. For example, consider something like algorithmic transparency and inclusion. That will be a pretty interesting thing to explore, and it's basically to involve different groups in these kind of projects. And I think that there are not only legal answers, as you mentioned, education. There are many other things that have to be explored. But I think that if we don't consider inclusion, we think AI design, there is a big risk that AI is not going to be as successful as many have promised, and that we actually not live this utopia, but actually perhaps a dystopia with the use of this technology.
What am I doing? Taking instructions from my phone.
What do you want me to do?
Can help introduce about.
We selling this?
Yeah.
Whatever you want.
No, terrific.
Okay.
So thank you, Governor, for inviting me here. And since I'm the only thing left before everybody leaves, I'll make this as short and brief as possible. So I wanted to first of all thank everybody, and obviously all the work, effort, communication, the contents that's getting generated here and for the past few years. It's very timely to try to do something more and to accelerate it. So a few years ago, I started AI World. I've been doing publishing for quite a long time. I actually have a background in AI and lived through a couple of AI winners. So upcoming, we have this event, AI World, and we're announcing here kind of that the Dukakis Global Initiative is one of our international hosts, and we are working towards, as is the Canadian government and a lot of other global partners that we have, and our goal is, for this event, is primarily a commercial event highlighting the innovation going across the world, the Global 2000 businesses. But what we're doing is we're expanding the event and working with Tuan and Governor Dukakis to create a program in June next year in DC, in Washington, DC, AI government. And we will be coordinating that, and I'm sure everybody will learn more about that over the coming months, probably announce it in a couple of months. So again, I just want to thank you for inviting us here, and looking forward to working with you. Thank you.
Great. Since I know less about this than anybody else in the room, all I can tell you is this has been a very interesting afternoon for me. And I think I'm representative of most Americans who really don't know a hell of a lot about this. So first, my thanks for joining us. We look forward to working with all of you. I hope this organization of ours, this effort of ours, can make a real contribution. I just want to say one thing in closing. Every time human beings have come up with dramatic improvements in technology, folks predict that half of us will be unemployed. It never happens. And there's no reason why it should happen. Now, it does require a real investment in skills training and education and all these kinds of things. But the one thing it seems to me we should not fear is widespread unemployment as a result of this. There's no reason for that. I mean, history tells us that done right and done obviously ethically and well, it can be an enormous benefit. And I hope we'll just keep that in mind. And keep bringing to people who think that, you know, we're going to have bread lines in the street because of artificial intelligence. There's no reason why that should happen. And I hope we just keep reminding people of that while we keep working. Special thanks to those of you who came distances to be with us. We're going to be working with you. And an extra special thanks to Swan, who really is responsible for making all this happen. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Governor. And also, we are very honored and thank you so much for your all for your participation. And thank you for your contribution, very important contribution to build the AI government, AIWS index we will introduce in the AI World Conference and Expo December 3 to December 5. That's a very largest event in AI in the world. So we hope we together with Aiws and AI World and together. And thank you so much for your contribution so far. And we think that is and Governor think about that we will have initiative for AIWS Square. And we send you already to think about that. And that is the first draft. And we hope the great brand will contribute for that great proposal. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you very much again, Governor, my dear leader.